The hum of the city buzzed through the glass walls of Channel 5 studios, towering above the skyline of Chicago. Outside, neon lights flickered against the darkened streets, and taxis zipped through the traffic, carrying people home after a long day. But inside the studio, Ethan Grant sat under the blinding stage lights, preparing for the most important interview of his career. At 38 years old, Ethan wasn't just an advocate. He was a force of nature as in the education world. A former public school teacher turned national nonprofit leader, he had spent the last decade fighting for better opportunities for students in underprivileged schools. His organization, Tomorrow's Scholars, had given out over $50 million in scholarships to students who had been written off by a system that never gave them a chance. He had walked through the halls of forgotten schools, spoken to students who felt invisible, and fought tirelessly to make sure every child had a shot at success. But tonight, he wasn't speaking in front of students or educators. Tonight, he was sitting across from Robert Lawson, the host of the Evening Spotlight, one of the most watched political talk shows in the country. Lawson was infamous for his sharp tongue, relentless questioning, and his habit of tearing apart guests who dared to challenge his views. Ethan knew what was coming. He had spent years preparing for this fight, and he wasn't backing down. The setup for a showdown. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Evening Spotlight. The cameras zoomed in on Robert Lawson, his expression smooth but sharp, like a knife gliding through silk. Tonight, we have with us a man who claims to be revolutionizing education, a man who believes that students from certain communities deserve special treatment. A slow, calculated pause. Ethan Grant, welcome to the show. Ethan didn't flinch. Thank you, Robert. I'm excited to talk about the work we're doing to change lives. The audience clapped politely, but there was an underlying tension in the room, the kind that comes before a storm. The first strike. For the first few minutes, the conversation remained civil. Ethan spoke about his journey, from a struggling teacher in an underfunded public school to building a national movement for change. He described students who had beaten the odds, young minds that had once been dismissed as statistics, but had gone on to become doctors, engineers, and leaders. Lawson nodded, listening. But Ethan could feel it coming. And then, just as the audience leaned in, captivated, the trap was set. Ethan, let's talk about your scholarship program, Lawson said, leaning forward. Tomorrow's Scholars is specifically designed for students from low-income minority backgrounds. Isn't that, well, exclusionary? The audience shifted. Ethan smiled, because he had heard this question before. Not at all, Robert, he said smoothly. What we're doing is addressing a need. If a house is on fire, do you hose down every house on the block, or do you start where the flames are? Some in the audience nodded, murmuring in agreement. But Lawson wasn't done. I hear you, Ethan, but isn't that just another way of saying you're picking favorites? Why not help everyone? Why only focus on minority students? The moment hung in the air. Ethan didn't blink. Robert, let me ask you this. When a hospital treats a patient with a life-threatening injury, do they treat everyone in the waiting room first, or do they save the person who's bleeding out? A wave of applause broke through the studio. Lawson's smile tightened. And just like that, the game had changed. A battle of ideals. Lawson wasn't one to let control slip through his fingers. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his voice smooth but edged with challenge. You say you're helping students overcome barriers, but aren't you just reinforcing a victim mentality? At what point do we stop making excuses and start telling kids to work harder? Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly. This was the same tired rhetoric he had fought against his entire career, and he was done with it. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Lawson's. "Robert, you seem to love the idea of working harder, so let's talk about that." The studio fell silent. "Let's talk about the kids in my program who wake up at 5 a.m. because their schools are an hour away, because their neighborhood schools were shut down. Let's talk about the students who do their homework by candlelight because their power got cut off. Let's talk about the kids who want to work harder but are carrying weights on their shoulders that others don't have to carry." A murmur spread through the audience. Ethan wasn't finished. "We love to talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. But let's be honest. Some kids weren't given boots. Some were given boots with holes in them. And some had their boots taken away before they could even walk." The audience erupted into applause. Lawson gritted his teeth. For the first time, the host, who was always in control, was losing ground. The moment that broke the internet. Lawson tried to recover. "That's an interesting perspective, Ethan. But doesn't focusing so much on race divide us further? Shouldn't we focus on unity instead of differences?" Ethan smiled. But this time it wasn't just a smile. It was a warning shot. "Robert, ignoring differences doesn't create unity. It creates silence." The audience leaned in. You can't build a bridge without acknowledging the river that separates people. You don't heal a wound by pretending it isn't there. And you don't fix a broken system by acting like it's already fair. Another thunderous round of applause. Lawson was outmatched. His polished smirk faltered for a split second before he forced out a strained laugh. "Well, Ethan, you certainly came prepared." Ethan chuckled. "Always." The aftermath, a moment that sparked a movement. The interview went viral. Clips of Ethan's words flooded social media. Ignoring differences doesn't create unity. It creates silence. Some kids weren't given boots. Some had their boots stolen. You don't fix a broken system by acting like it's already fair. By morning, #EthanGrant was trending. By afternoon, donations to tomorrow's scholars skyrocketed. By evening, universities and politicians were discussing real policy changes. One interview, one conversation, and the world had been forced to listen. A call to action. Be the change. This isn't just about Ethan Grant. It's about every student who has ever been told they don't belong. It's about every person who has been told to work harder without being given a fair chance. If you believe in real change, if you believe in breaking barriers, if you believe in fighting for a fair system, then take action. Like this video to support Ethan's mission. Comment below. What changes do you think need to be made in education? Subscribe to this channel for more powerful stories that challenge the status quo. Because this fight isn't over, and your voice is part of it. The night was crisp, the Chicago skyline glowing under the stars, but inside the grand hall of the Adams Foundation Gala, the air was thick with tension. At the center of the event stood Ethan Grant, a man whose very presence commanded attention. At 38 years old, he was more than just a former teacher. He was the architect of hope for thousands of students across the country. His organization, Tomorrow's Scholars, had helped underprivileged students, kids who had been ignored by a system that never expected them to succeed, secure scholarships, mentorship, and a real chance at a future. But tonight, none of that mattered. Because tonight, his entire initiative was on the line. The Adams Foundation, one of the wealthiest philanthropic organizations in the country, was considering pulling their funding from his program. And their reasoning? Your program focuses too much on minority students. We believe scholarships should be for everyone. It wasn't about fairness. It was about power. And Ethan was about to find out just how much people in power hated to see the underprivileged rise. The first blow Ethan adjusted his tie, his face unreadable as he stood in the crowd of billionaires, politicians, and corporate executives. Across the room, Jonathan Adams, the chairman of the foundation, stood with a drink in hand, laughing among his colleagues. Ethan approached with careful, measured steps. "Jonathan," he said, his voice even but firm. Adams turned, his easy smile faltering for just a second before he covered it with feigned warmth. "Ethan, I was just talking about you. We were just discussing the future of your program." Ethan knew what that meant. They were deciding whether or not to let tomorrow's scholars survive. "That's good to hear, Jonathan," Ethan said, matching his polished tone. "Because I have some things I'd like to discuss with you as well." Jonathan chuckled, but there was an edge to his amusement. "Of course, but first let's grab a drink. No need to be so serious." But Ethan wasn't here to sip champagne and play along. "Actually, Jonathan, I'd prefer we discuss it now." The smile dropped from Jonathan's face. The room grew quieter. Ethan could feel eyes turning toward them, because everyone loved a good confrontation. The attack on his mission. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed that Ethan was refusing to wait like a polite guest. "Look, Ethan, I know you're passionate about this program, but we have concerns. We've been reviewing the numbers, and quite frankly, your scholarships are disproportionately given to minority students. Don't you think that's a little unfair?" There it was. The real reason behind the hesitation. Ethan had heard it before, but every time, it boiled his blood. Keeping his composure, he tilted his head. "Unfair?" he echoed. "Are you suggesting that fairness means ignoring the fact that these students have historically been denied opportunities?" Jonathan forced a chuckle, trying to brush off the weight of the question. "I'm saying that we need to focus on all students, Ethan, not just one group. What about fairness for everyone?" Ethan could feel people leaning in now, listening. Good, because he was about to make a point that no one in this room would forget. The moment that shifted the room. Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice steady but sharp as a blade. "Jonathan, let me ask you something." A pause. "If a school bus full of children crashes and half of them are critically injured, do you give every single child the same treatment? Or do you treat the ones who are bleeding out first?" The murmurs in the room intensified. Jonathan's jaw tightened, but Ethan wasn't finished. "That's what we're doing. We're treating the kids who've been ignored, who've been left behind, who've been told they have to work twice as hard just to be seen as equal." He let that sink in. "If you have a problem with that, Jonathan, then maybe your issue isn't with fairness. Maybe it's with who gets to succeed." The audience stirred. Someone clapped. Then another. And then, to Jonathan's horror, half the room erupted into applause. The final blow. Jonathan was cornered, and he knew it. His lips pressed into a thin line as he straightened his suit jacket. "That's a very passionate argument, Ethan. But at the end of the day, this foundation has to make decisions that align with its broader mission." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And what mission is that? Keeping the same people in power?" The applause grew louder. Jonathan swallowed, his composure cracking for just a second before he forced a tight smile. "We'll be in touch." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked away. But Ethan knew. Jonathan had lost. Because the people in that room, the donors, the philanthropists, the media, had heard the truth. And truth had a way of spreading like wildfire. The aftermath, a victory won in the open. By the next morning, Ethan's confrontation had gone viral. The video had been captured by a reporter in the audience, and now it was all over social media. If a school bus crashes, do you treat the ones who need it most first, or ignore them for the sake of fairness? Ethan Grant takes on billionaire donors, exposes the truth about fairness in education. The fight for real equality isn't over. Within 24 hours, the Adams Foundation received tens of thousands of messages from people demanding they continue funding tomorrow's scholars. By the end of the week, they caved. They not only restored the funding, they doubled it. Because Ethan had made sure the whole world was watching, and they couldn't afford to be on the wrong side of history. A call to action. Be part of the change. Ethan. Grant didn't just win a debate that night. He proved that speaking up matters, that challenging the system matters, that fighting for those who have been ignored isn't just a choice, it's a responsibility. And now, it's your turn. If you believe that every student deserves a chance at success, like this video. Comment below. What do you think needs to change in our education system? Your voice matters. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo and demand justice, because this fight isn't over. And your voice is part of it. The debate that shook the nation. The atmosphere inside Channel 7 studios crackled with anticipation. The stage lights burned bright, casting an intense glow on the two figures seated across from each other. The sleek glass table between them reflected the tension in the room. Tonight's episode of the Evening Spotlight was supposed to be a simple discussion on education reform, but anyone familiar with Robert Lawson, the show's notorious host, knew that was never the case. And Ethan Grant was ready. At 38 years old, he had become one of the most influential education reform advocates in the country. His program, Tomorrow's Scholars, had helped thousands of low-income students secure scholarships, mentorship, and educational resources. He had walked into failing schools, sat across from students who had been told they'd never make it, and fought tooth and nail to give them a chance. But tonight, he wasn't sitting across from students. He was sitting across from a man who thrived on controversy. And Robert Lawson had one goal tonight: to tear him down. The battle begins. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Evening Spotlight. Lawson's voice was smooth, polished, the kind of voice designed to manipulate an audience without them even realizing it. The cameras zoomed in, capturing his smirk as he turned toward Ethan. Tonight, we have with us a man who believes that students from certain communities deserve special treatment, a man who claims the education system is unfair. Ethan Grant, welcome. Ethan didn't flinch. Thank you, Robert. I'm here to talk about how we can create real opportunities for students who have been ignored for far too long. The audience clapped politely, but there was already an edge in the air. And then, just as expected, Lawson made his first move. The first strike. Ethan, let's get straight to it. Your program, Tomorrow's Scholars, provides scholarships specifically for minority students. Doesn't that sound exclusionary? The question hung in the air like bait. Ethan knew this tactic. It was a trap designed to make him seem like he was against equality rather than fighting for it. But he was ready. Robert, let me ask you something. Lawson blinked, thrown off by the immediate counterattacks. Ethan leaned forward. If a firefighter arrives at a burning house, do they spray water on every house in the neighborhood just to be fair? Or do they put out the fire that's actually happening? A murmur spread through the audience. Lawson's smirk twitched, but he wasn't done. The host tries to regain control. I see your point, Ethan, Lawson said, sitting back in his chair as if he were entertained. But let's be real. We live in a country where hard work is what separates success from failure. Why focus so much on barriers? Why not encourage students to work harder instead of making excuses? The audience reacted. Some with applause, others with uneasy shifting in their seats. Ethan's jaw tightened, but only for a second. because he had heard this too many times before. Hard work is important, Robert, but let's not pretend that every student starts from the same starting line. The studio fell silent. Ethan's voice was steady, but it carried weight. I've met kids who wake up at 4:30 a.m. to take 2 buses just to get to school. I've met kids who do homework by candlelight because their power was shut off. I've met kids who work jobs after school, not for pocket money, but to help their families afford rent. He paused, letting the reality sink in. We love to talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, but how do you do that if you were never given boots in the first place? The audience erupted into applause, and for the first time, Lawson's smirk disappeared. The moment that broke the internet. Lawson leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. That's an emotional argument, Ethan. But let's talk about unity. Isn't it better to focus on what brings us together rather than what divides us? Wouldn't it be better if your program was open to everyone instead of targeting only certain groups? Ethan's expression didn't waver. Robert, unity doesn't mean ignoring reality. A pause. You can't build a bridge without acknowledging the river that separates people. You don't fix a broken system by pretending it's already fair. Another wave of applause. But Lawson still wasn't ready to lose. He leaned back, eyes gleaming, a predator going in for the kill. Let's cut through the feel-good speeches, Ethan. Your program is selective. Some would say it creates division instead of solving it. In fact, some might say it's just another form of modern-day segregation. Isn't that ironic? The audience gasped. Some people clapped, others looked visibly uncomfortable. For a split second, even the camera crew hesitated. But Ethan? He smiled, because now he wasn't just responding. He was about to end this. The final blow. What's ironic, Robert? Ethan said slowly, his voice cool, controlled, but edged with fire, is that people love to talk about fairness when it's about lifting others up, but never when the system has already left them behind. The audience leaned in. Segregation was about exclusion, about keeping people out. What I'm doing is the opposite. I'm opening doors that were slammed shut for generations. The studio was silent. Lawson opened his mouth, but for the first time, nothing came out. Ethan leaned forward. And you know what's really ironic? A pause. That when people like me try to fix these problems, we're accused of being divisive. But when the system created them in the first place, people like you just called it business as usual. The audience exploded. People stood up, clapping. Even members of the production crew were nodding. Lawson sat there, his face blank, struggling to regain control. But it was too late, because the debate was over. The aftermath, a nationwide movement. Within hours, the interview was trending. Clips of Ethan's words flooded social media. You don't fix a broken system by pretending it's already fair. Some kids weren't given boots. Some had their boots stolen. When we try to fix injustice, suddenly it's divisive. But when the system created it, no one said a word. By the next morning, Ethan Grant was the top trending topic on Twitter. Donations to tomorrow's scholars skyrocketed. Colleges reached out, offering additional funding. And most importantly, people started having real conversations about privilege, education, and opportunity. All because one man refused to stay silent. A call to action. Your voice matters. Ethan didn't just win a debate that night. He changed the conversation. And now, it's your turn. Like this video if you believe in equal education for all. Comment below. What do you think should change in our education system? Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Because this fight isn't over, and your voice is part of it. The battle for equal education. One voice against the system. The night air was cool in Washington, D.C., but inside the grand marble halls of the Capitol, the atmosphere was anything but. The hearing room was packed. Politicians, activists, reporters, and students filled every seat. Television cameras stood ready, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Ethan Grant, 38 years old, a former schoolteacher turned education reform activist. For the past 10 years, he had fought for students who had been left behind by a broken education system. Kids who were brilliant but ignored, who had talent but no access, who had potential but no support. His program, Tomorrow's Scholars, had sent thousands of underprivileged students to college, giving them a chance the system had denied them. But today, that very program was under attack. Today, Ethan sat before a panel of lawmakers, many of whom wanted to see his program shut down. The reason? Because it focused on helping minority students, and in their eyes, that made it unfair. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a battle. And Ethan was fighting for more than just funding. He was fighting for every student who had ever been told they weren't good enough. The attack begins. The chairman, Senator Richard Caldwell, a man known for his strong opposition to affirmative action, leaned forward, his expression cold and rehearsed. Mr. Grant, let's get straight to the point. Your organization, Tomorrow's Scholars, provides scholarships primarily for minority students. Wouldn't you agree that's exclusionary? Ethan met his gaze, his hands steady on the table. No, Senator, I wouldn't. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Caldwell raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. So, you don't think it's unfair to provide resources to only certain groups of students? Ethan's heart pounded, but his voice remained calm and unwavering. Senator, let me ask you something. A pause. If a hospital has 10 patients and 5 of them have life-threatening injuries, should the doctors treat everyone the same? Or should they focus on saving the ones who need it most? The audience shifted, a few nodding in agreement. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another senator, Margaret Ellis, a strong supporter of Ethan's work, interjected. Mr. Grant, can you clarify why your program specifically targets underserved students? Ethan took a deep breath, knowing this was his moment. The reality of the system. Because they have been ignored for generations, Senator. The room fell silent. I have walked through schools with crumbling ceilings. I have met students who share one textbook with 5 classmates. I have seen kids who are as brilliant as anyone else, but have been told that college isn't for people like them. His voice grew stronger. This isn't about preference. This is about correcting a wrong, about giving these students the same opportunities that wealthier schools have had for decades. A slow wave of applause started in the back of the room. But Caldwell wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. That's a nice speech, Mr. Grant. But what do you say to the hard-working students who don't qualify for your program? The ones who feel left out? Ethan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. This argument again. He looked directly at Caldwell, his voice turning sharp as steel. Senator, let's be honest. No one complained about fairness when minority students were the ones being excluded. No one called it unfair when certain schools got more funding, more resources, and better teachers while others were left to rot. Another murmur rippled through the room. Ethan leaned in. This isn't about fairness, it's about power, and some people don't like seeing that power being shared. The applause grew louder. Caldwell's face turned red, but before he could respond, Ethan stood up. The emotional climax. The testimony that changed everything. I want to tell you a story. The room went still. Ethan's voice softened, but the emotion behind it was raw. A few years ago, I met a student named Marcus. He was one of the smartest kids I'd ever met, but he didn't have access to SAT prep courses, couldn't afford a tutor, and went to a school that barely had enough teachers. He took a breath. Marcus applied to 5 colleges. He got rejected from all of them, not because he wasn't smart enough, but because he was never given the same chances as students in wealthier districts. The audience was silent now. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. Ethan's voice grew stronger. I started tomorrow's Scholars for students like Marcus, and last year, because of our program, he got a full scholarship to Howard University. A pause. So, when you sit here and ask me why my program exists, I ask you, why did it take this long for someone to fix the problem in the first place? The room erupted into applause. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even some of the politicians on Caldwell's side looked conflicted. But Caldwell? He looked defeated. He muttered something under his breath, but Ethan didn't care. Because he had already won. The aftermath. A movement begins. Within hours, the testimony went viral. This isn't about fairness, it's about power. No one complained about fairness when minority students were the ones being excluded. If a house is on fire, do you water the whole neighborhood? Or do you put out the flames? By the next morning, #EthanGrant was trending. News outlets covered the hearing. Colleges pledged new scholarships for underserved students. Celebrities and public figures voiced their support. But most importantly, students who had been ignored finally felt seen. And Ethan? He wasn't stopping. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a revolution. A call to action. Stand up for what's right. Ethan Grant stood up against a system that was built to keep people down. And he won. But this fight isn't just his. If you believe every student deserves a chance, like this video, comment below, what do you think needs to change in our education system? Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo, because the fight for fairness isn't over, and your voice is part of it. The lights inside the Grand Senate hearing chamber shone brightly, casting an unrelenting glow over the polished mahogany table where Ethan Grant sat, his hands folded, his expression composed but intense. A row of politicians stared down at him, their expressions ranging from polite disinterest to open hostility. Behind him, a sea of spectators filled the chamber, reporters with their cameras rolling, students clutching notebooks, activists waiting for a spark that could ignite change. Ethan knew what this moment meant. It wasn't just another hearing. It wasn't just another policy debate. It was a battle for the future of education in America. And he was sitting in the lion's den. At 38 years old, Ethan had dedicated his life to education reform, fighting for students who had been failed by the system. His organization, Tomorrow's Scholars, had given thousands of underprivileged students a chance at college, a shot at success, a hope they were never supposed to have. But today, his work was under attack. The government was considering defunding his program, accusing it of being too focused on minority students, claiming it was divisive, that it promoted special treatment instead of equality. And sitting across from him, leading this charge, was Senator Richard Caldwell, a man who had spent years blocking educational reforms that aimed to help underserved students. This was it, a fight that would determine not just the fate of tomorrow's scholars, but the fate of thousands of students depending on it. And Ethan? He wasn't backing down. The first strike. Caldwell cleared his throat, adjusting his microphone, his expression smooth but smug. "Mr. Grant, let's get straight to the point." His voice was calculated, dripping with the false politeness of a man who thought he had already won. Your program, Tomorrow's Scholars, is designed specifically for low-income minority students. Don't you think that's unfair? Shouldn't all students, regardless of race, have an equal opportunity to receive help? The question hung in the air, baiting him, waiting for a stumble. Ethan didn't blink. He had been waiting for this. Slowly, he leaned forward, his voice steady. Senator, let me ask you something. A pause. If a school bus crashes and 5 of the students inside are critically injured, do you treat all the students the same? Or do you focus on the ones who are bleeding out? The audience stirred, murmurs spreading through the chamber. Caldwell's smirk tightened, but Ethan wasn't finished. That's what we're doing. We're helping the students who have been ignored, underfunded, and left behind. We're not taking anything away from anyone else. We're simply making sure these kids get a fair chance. The crowd erupted in quiet applause, but Caldwell leaned back, undeterred. A powerful analogy, Mr. Grant, he said, his tone slick, practiced. But shouldn't we be focusing on unity rather than division? Shouldn't we be creating programs that help everyone instead of prioritizing certain groups? There it was, the same argument Ethan had heard for years. And he was done playing defense. The emotional climax. The story that changed everything. Ethan took a deep breath. He knew logic alone wouldn't win this battle. So he reached for something stronger. The truth. Senator, I want to tell you a story. The chamber fell silent. The audience leaned in. Even Caldwell narrowed his eyes, sensing a shift. 3 years ago, I met a student named Jordan. Ethan's voice softened, but the intensity in his eyes grew sharper. Jordan was one of the brightest kids I'd ever met. He had a mind built for engineering. He could take apart a radio and rebuild it from scratch before he was 10 years old. But Jordan didn't go to a school with a robotics program. He didn't have access to AP courses. A pause. Because his school didn't have them. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience. Jordan had dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer. But when it came time for SAT prep, he couldn't afford a tutor. His school didn't offer test prep courses. The only thing he could do was go online and try to teach himself. Ethan's fingers clenched slightly on the table. Meanwhile, across town, another school, one with higher funding, better resources, had an entire SAT preparation program. Those students didn't have to worry about learning on their own. His eyes locked onto Caldwell's. Jordan didn't get into his dream school, but the students from the other school did. The audience was silent now, hanging on to every word. So when you ask me if my program is unfair, I ask you, where was this outrage when kids like Jordan were being left behind? Why didn't I see anyone calling for unity when those students were being shut out of opportunities? A reporter in the audience dropped his pen. A woman in the second row wiped her eyes. Caldwell shifted in his seat. And Ethan? He wasn't done. Jordan was brilliant, but brilliance wasn't enough, because he didn't have the same access, the same opportunities, the same chances. A long, heavy pause. That's why Tomorrow's Scholars exists. To give kids like Jordan the tools they should have had all along. The crowd exploded into applause. Caldwell paled. The cameras zoomed in on Ethan's face. And in that moment, the world finally saw the truth. The aftermath. A nationwide movement. The next morning, Ethan Grant's testimony was everywhere. Where was the outrage when kids like Jordan were being left behind? You can't fix a broken system by pretending it's already fair. This isn't about division. It's about giving everyone the same chance. By the end of the week, the government withdrew its attempt to defund Tomorrow's Scholars, private donors stepped up, pledging millions to expand the program. High schools across the country started implementing new college prep initiatives for underserved students. But most importantly, students who had been ignored, dismissed, and overlooked finally had hope. And Ethan? He wasn't stopping. Because this wasn't just about a single victory. It was about changing the system for good. A call to action. Stand with Ethan Grant. Ethan Grant stood up against a system that was built to keep certain students down. And he won. But this fight isn't just his. It belongs to every student who has ever been told they don't belong. It belongs to every parent who has had to fight for their child's education. It belongs to you. If you believe every student deserves a fair chance, like this video. Comment below. What do you think should change in our education system? Encourage Ethan's fight. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Because the fight for fairness isn't over. And your voice is part of it. A fight against the system. One teacher's battle for his students. The rain pounded against the windows of the dimly lit classroom, each droplet echoing through the empty halls of Jefferson High School. At the front of the room, Ethan Grant sat at his desk, hands steepled, his eyes scanning the stack of failing test scores in front of him. The papers felt heavy in his hands, not just because of the ink on the page, but because of what they represented. Another class of students being set up to fail. Another year of brilliant young minds being discarded by a broken system. Ethan had been teaching for 10 years, and each year it was the same fight. Underfunded schools, outdated textbooks, students full of potential but abandoned by policymakers who didn't see them as worth the investment. But this year, it was different. Because this year, they were threatening to shut the school down completely. And if that happened, the students who had nowhere else to go, the ones who depended on this school as their last chance, would be left with nothing. He took a slow breath, pressing his fingers against his temples. The school board meeting was in 1 week, and he had exactly 7 days to convince them that Jefferson High deserved to stay open. But deep down, he knew the truth. The decision had already been made, and it had nothing to do with academics. It had everything to do with money and politics. And if Ethan didn't do something drastic, something that would force the world to see these students, then Jefferson High would become just another forgotten name on a list of schools that had been erased. A system designed to fail. The next morning, Ethan walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing on the cracked linoleum floors. The school felt different now, as if it already knew its fate. In the cafeteria, the lights flickered, and he could hear the hum of a faulty generator struggling to keep the power running. In the classrooms, students huddled together, wearing jackets inside because the school's heating system had been broken for months. He passed by Jordan, one of the brightest students in his class, staring at a malfunctioning laptop with a cracked screen, struggling to complete his college application. The school was falling apart. And the worst part? The district had made it this way on purpose. They had slowly drained funding, year after year, until the school was so run down, so underperforming, that shutting it down looked like the only logical option. Ethan clenched his fists. They weren't shutting Jefferson down because it had failed. They were shutting it down because they wanted it to fail. Because closing down the school would free up land for new developments, new projects, new opportunities, for everyone except the students who actually needed help. And they expected him to just accept that. They expected him to stay quiet. But they were wrong. Because Ethan Grant wasn't going down without a fight. The impossible task. You can't be serious. Across the desk, Principal Diane Carter sighed, rubbing her temples. Ethan, I admire your passion, but do you really think you can change their minds? The school board has already made their decision. This meeting is just a formality. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we make them change their minds. Principal Carter leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. And how do you plan to do that? They have statistics, test scores, and budget reports that all support shutting us down. What do we have? Ethan's voice hardened. We have our students. Diane exhaled sharply. Ethan, no, listen to me, Diane. They've spent years painting our school as a failure, but they've never actually met the students they're failing. We need to put faces to these numbers. We need to show them who they're abandoning. He leaned forward, determination burning in his eyes. If we can get the public to see what's happening, we can make this a fight they can't ignore. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Diane shook her head and sighed. You really don't know how to quit, do you? Ethan smirked. Never. The plan that changed everything. For the next 6 days, Ethan worked harder than he ever had before. He gathered testimonies from students, recorded videos, collected personal stories, documented every success story Jefferson High had produced. He got parents involved, held community meetings, called local reporters. And most importantly, he made sure the students had a voice. By the night before the school board meeting, the entire city was watching. News stations were running stories. Hashtags were trending online. People who had never even heard of Jefferson High were suddenly invested in its fight to survive. And as Ethan stood in front of his students that night looking at the hopeful faces that had once felt invisible, he realized something. They had already won, because no matter what happened tomorrow, the world was finally listening. The showdown. The school board meeting was held in a packed auditorium, standing room only. Ethan sat in the front row, his students beside him. At the podium, Senator Caldwell, one of the biggest supporters of closing Jefferson High, adjusted his tie, glancing at the cameras before beginning. This decision is not easy, but we must be responsible with taxpayer dollars. We cannot continue to fund failing schools. He gestured toward a PowerPoint slide filled with statistics, test scores, graduation rates, budget cuts, all twisted to justify shutting the school down. Ethan's fingers tightened on his chair. Then it was his turn. He stepped up to the podium, heart pounding, the faces of his students watching him with hope. He took a breath, and he spoke the truth. Jefferson High didn't fail. It was set up to fail. Murmurs spread through the audience. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. For years, this school has been stripped of its resources, its funding, and its opportunities. You want to know why our test scores are low? It's because we're expected to compete without the tools we need to succeed. His voice rose. You say this school is a waste of taxpayer money, but let me ask you, where was this concern when you cut our funding? When you ignored our broken infrastructure? When you let our students struggle while other schools flourished? Applause erupted from the audience. Caldwell's face turned red. Ethan looked him in the eye. We are not asking for favors. We are demanding fairness. We are demanding the chance that every student deserves. And if you truly believe in education, you will not turn your back on us. The applause grew louder, cheers echoing through the room. And in that moment, Caldwell knew he had lost. The victory that inspired a movement. By the next morning, the news was everywhere. Jefferson High had won. The school board reversed their decision. The district pledged funding for repairs and new resources. And most importantly, other struggling schools across the country saw what was possible when people refused to stay silent. Ethan Grant had fought for his students, and he had won. But this wasn't just his fight. It was ours. A call to action. Fight for the future. Like this video if you believe every student deserves a chance. Comment below. What changes do you think need to happen in our education system? Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to back down. Because education is worth fighting for, and your voice is part of the battle. The breaking point: a teacher's fight against corruption. The cold fluorescent lights flickered above the nearly empty staff lounge at Brookside High School, casting long shadows across the cracked tile floor. Ethan Grant sat at the worn-out table, staring at the thick envelope in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it, already knowing what was inside. It was a termination letter. After 10 years of teaching, of fighting for his students, of demanding better resources, fair treatment, and real opportunities, this was how it ended. He had been warned by the principal, by the school board, even by some of his own colleagues. "Ethan, stop making trouble. You're pushing too hard. The system is what it is. If you keep this up, they'll find a way to get rid of you." And now they had. A war against the system. Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had known for months that something was wrong. The district had been quietly cutting funds from Brookside, redirecting the money to wealthier, better-performing schools across town. Meanwhile, his students sat in freezing classrooms, sharing outdated textbooks and struggling on broken computers while being expected to perform at the same level as students in schools with every possible advantage. Ethan had spoken up. He had written letters, attended board meetings, confronted politicians, and he had started digging deeper. That was when he had found the documents. Records proving that millions of dollars meant for Brookside had been funneled into real estate projects, lining the pockets of school officials instead of funding students' education. When he exposed it, the retaliation came fast. Classroom inspections, unannounced observations, false accusations about his teaching, and now, this letter. But as Ethan sat in that silent lounge, staring at his own dismissal, he knew one thing for certain. They had made a mistake. Because if they thought firing him would stop him, they didn't know who they were dealing with. A community rises. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Brookside to clear out his desk. As he walked through the halls for what could be the last time, he saw the faces of his students, some already whispering, some staring in disbelief, and others outright angry. By the time he reached his classroom, a crowd of students had gathered outside, and at the front of them stood Jordan Carter, one of his brightest seniors. Jordan shoved a crumpled piece of paper into Ethan's hand. A petition. "Mr. Grant, you're not leaving." Ethan looked up, his heart pounding. "Jordan, no, listen." Jordan's voice shook with emotion. "We know what's happening. We know they don't care about us. But you do. And if they think we're just going to let them take you away, they're wrong." Ethan's chest tightened as he looked at the petition. Hundreds of names, students, parents, even some teachers who had been too afraid to speak out before. And then Jordan handed him something else. A flash drive. "We have proof." Ethan's breath caught. "Proof?" Jordan nodded. "We found the emails. The school board. They knew the money was missing. They covered it up." Ethan's hands trembled. This was bigger than him, and now there was no turning back. The battle for the truth. That night, Ethan met with a small group of students and parents in a packed community center. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop, projecting the files onto the wall. Gasps filled the room. Bank transfers, fraudulent invoices, internal memos instructing officials to reallocate funds, a direct trail of corruption. "We take this public," Ethan said, his voice firm. "But we do it the right way. We go to the press, we go to the people." But before he could say another word, His phone buzzed. A blocked number. A message. "Drop this! Walk away, or else!" Ethan stared at the screen. The room fell silent. "Mr. Grant!" Jordan's voice wavered. Ethan looked at the faces around him, people who had spent their whole lives being silenced. And then he made a decision. We go forward, no matter what. The moment that changed everything. The next morning, the story hit the news. School district accused of diverting millions from underserved schools. Leaked emails suggest cover-up at highest levels. Brookside High teacher fired after exposing fraud. It spread like wildfire. Parents protested outside the school board's office. Reporters demanded answers. And the corrupt officials? They panicked. That evening, Ethan received another call. This time it wasn't anonymous. It was Superintendent Robert Klein, the man at the top of the chain. His voice was cold and calm. "Ethan, let's be reasonable. You've made your point. We'll reinstate you. We'll restore some funding. Just drop this." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. That's not enough. A pause. "What do you want?" Ethan's voice was steady as stone. "I want full transparency. I want independent audits. I want every stolen dollar returned to these students. And I want every person involved in this to resign." Silence. Then Klein chuckled. "You think you've won, don't you?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "I know I have." And then he hung up. Justice served. By the end of the week, the entire district was under investigation. 2 board members resigned. The superintendent was placed on leave. Millions of dollars were allocated back to the schools that had been stolen from. Ethan was reinstated as a teacher and promoted to lead a new education reform initiative. But the biggest victory? His students had learned that their voices mattered, that they didn't have to accept injustice, that when they stood together, they could change the world. A call to action. This fight is far from over. Ethan Grant stood up against corruption, and he won. But this isn't just one school's story. It's happening everywhere. Schools are being defunded, students are being ignored, communities are being left behind, and the people in power count on us staying silent. Let's prove them wrong. Like this video if you believe every student deserves a fair chance. Comment below. What do you think should change in our education system? Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Because this fight isn't over, and your voice is part of it. The price of truth. A teacher's stand against corruption. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside as Ethan Grant gripped the edges of the podium in the packed school board meeting hall. The air was thick with tension, the overhead lights buzzing faintly as he looked at the sea of angry faces before him. Half of the crowd was furious parents, students, and teachers rallying behind him. People who had finally found their voice after years of being ignored, underfunded, and dismissed. The other half? School board members, district officials, and their wealthy allies, all of whom had spent years bleeding the education system dry and were now desperate to silence him. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the final battle. And he wasn't just fighting for his job anymore. He was fighting for the future of every student who had ever been denied a fair chance. The unraveling of a conspiracy. It had started with a single missing budget report. A small red flag buried in the hundreds of documents Ethan had been reviewing late one night, long after his students had gone home. Brookside High, where he had been teaching for the last 10 years, had been suffering from crippling budget cuts for years, leaking ceilings, broken computers, outdated textbooks from 2 decades ago. The district's excuse? There just isn't enough funding. But the numbers didn't add up. And when Ethan dug deeper, what he found shattered him. Millions of dollars, meant for struggling schools like Brookside, had been quietly reallocated, not to other schools, but to luxury district offices, real estate projects, and private investments. They weren't just failing the students. They were stealing from them. Ethan had brought his findings to the school board immediately, expecting outrage, expecting action. Instead, he was shut down, threatened. And then, 2 days later, he was fired. Officially, for inappropriate behavior, a vague, baseless accusation they hoped would discredit him. Unofficially, for exposing the truth. But if they thought firing him would keep him quiet, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The call for justice. Ethan had turned to the people. He rallied parents and students, exposing the scandal in a fiery speech that went viral overnight. News outlets picked up the story, and within days, a full-blown movement erupted. A demand for transparency, accountability, and justice. The district tried to suppress it, claiming it was all misinformation, that Ethan was just a disgruntled former teacher looking for attention. But the evidence was undeniable. Leaked emails, falsified reports, video testimonials from teachers, staff, and even former district employees who confirmed Ethan's findings. And then, the final nail in the coffin. One of the school board members, David Langston, flipped. A man who had been deep in the corruption but too spineless to take the fall alone, he had turned over confidential documents, audio recordings, and memos that left no room for doubt. Brookside High, and countless other struggling schools across the district, had been systematically starved of funds while executives lived in luxury. And tonight, at this school board meeting, Ethan was going to make sure the world heard the truth. The showdown. Ethan's voice was calm, but filled with fire as he faced the board members who had tried to destroy him. For years, you've told us that there wasn't enough money to fix our schools, that there wasn't enough funding to give our students the opportunities they deserved. His gaze locked onto Superintendent Robert Klein, the man at the center of it all. And yet, here we are, looking at documents that prove you had the money all along, that you chose to spend it on yourselves while students sat in freezing classrooms using textbooks older than their parents. The crowd erupted in outrage, parents shouting, students holding up protest signs. Superintendent Klein leaned into the microphone, his voice ice cold. Mr. Grant, I suggest you tread carefully. Making baseless accusations in a public forum can have serious consequences. Ethan didn't blink. Oh, I agree, Mr. Klein. That's why I came prepared. He pulled a USB drive from his pocket and held it up for the cameras. This contains every stolen dollar, every falsified report, every lie you've told this community. And in about 5 minutes, it's going live on every major news outlet in the country. The entire room exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters rushed forward, demanding statements. Klein went pale, turning to his legal team, whispering furiously. But Ethan wasn't done yet. He turned to the audience, his students, his fellow teachers, the parents who had spent years fighting a system designed to keep them powerless. They want us to believe that we don't matter, that our children's futures don't matter, that they can keep taking from us, and we'll just sit back and accept it. He slammed his hand on the podium, his voice rising. But they were wrong. The crowd erupted, a roaring wave of cheers, chants, and pure defiance. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. The aftermath. Justice is served. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Superintendent Klein was arrested on charges of embezzlement and corruption. 2 school board members resigned before they could be investigated. The governor called for a full audit of the entire district's finances. Brookside High, and every school that had been starved of funding, received millions in restitution. And Ethan? The district offered him his job back. With a hefty salary increase, full control over a new education reform initiative, and a promise of policy changes. But Ethan wasn't interested in going back to business as usual. Instead, he launched the Educators Alliance, a nationwide watchdog group dedicated to exposing corruption in education, holding officials accountable, and ensuring that no school was ever robbed of its future again. Because this fight? It wasn't over, and it never would be, until every student in every classroom had the same chance at success. A call to action. Stand up for education. Ethan Grant stood up against corruption, and he won. But this isn't just one man's story. It's a story happening in schools across the country. Like this video if you believe every student deserves a fair chance. Comment below. What do you think should change in our education system? Encourage Ethan's fight. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo. Because the fight for fairness isn't over, and your voice is part of it. The relentless fight, a teacher's stand against corruption. The city lights flickered against the cold courtroom windows, casting a pale glow over Ethan Grant's tired face. The air inside the courtroom was heavy with tension, the kind that made people hold their breath, waiting for something to explode. Ethan sat at the defendant's table, his wrists aching from the too tight handcuffs, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. Across from him, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, was Superintendent Robert Klein, the man who had orchestrated the greatest educational fraud the district had ever seen. A man who had stolen millions of dollars meant for struggling schools, a man who had destroyed careers, crushed futures, and expected to get away with it. And yet, somehow, Ethan was the one on trial. His crime? Daring to expose the truth, framed for speaking out. Ethan had known from the moment he exposed the corruption that there would be consequences, but he had never expected them to arrest him. The charges were manufactured, claims of unauthorized access to district records, defamation, and even inciting public disorder. In reality, they were desperate attempts to silence him. They wanted to make an example of him. They wanted every teacher, every parent, every student who had rallied behind him to see what happens to those who challenge the system. But they had underestimated him, because Ethan wasn't giving up. The trial begins. The judge entered, his expression unreadable. The gallery was filled with reporters, students, and parents who had come to witness this battle for justice. The prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie. Your Honor, the defendant, Mr. Ethan Grant, is accused of illegally accessing classified documents, fabricating false accusations, and causing mass disruption within the school district. Ethan clenched his jaw. They were twisting the truth into a weapon. He had not hacked any records. He had not lied. He had revealed the truth. And for that, they wanted to destroy him. His lawyer, Sarah Miller, rose. Your Honor, my client did not commit any crimes. He uncovered evidence of corruption, evidence that the prosecution is conveniently ignoring. The judge raised an eyebrow. And where is this evidence? A long pause. Because Ethan's evidence? It had disappeared. The files, the documents that proved everything, had been wiped from the servers overnight. Gone. Just like that. A perfectly executed cover-up. And without that proof, it was his word against theirs. A shocking betrayal. Ethan's heart sank. He had been so careful. He had backed up everything, made copies, ensured the files were protected. But someone inside his own team had turned against him. Someone had sold him out. And that's when he saw him. David Langston. A former board member. A whistleblower. Or so Ethan had thought. Langston had been the one who handed over the first set of evidence. The one who had sworn he wanted justice. But now he sat on the prosecution's side, refusing to meet Ethan's eyes. A traitor. Ethan's chest burned with anger. They had gotten to him. Threatened him. Bribed him. Whatever it was, Langston had flipped. And now Ethan was alone, or so he thought. A community fights back. Just as the prosecution prepared to seal Ethan's fate, the courtroom doors burst open. A flood of students, parents, teachers, hundreds of people stormed in. At the front, holding up a laptop, was Jordan Carter, one of Ethan's former students. "Your Honor," Jordan's voice rang through the courtroom. "We have the proof." A gasp rippled through the room. Ethan's eyes widened. How? How had they gotten the files back? Jordan set the laptop on the table, turning the screen to the judge. Mr. Grant made copies of the files, but when they were erased, we found something he missed. The judge leaned in as the screen displayed a hidden backup drive, one even Ethan had forgotten about. Emails, bank transfers, proof of every stolen dollar, every corrupt deal, every lie. Klein's face turned deathly pale. The entire courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. But it was too late. The truth had been set free. The verdict. The trial turned on its head. The charges against Ethan? Dropped immediately. Superintendent Klein? Arrested on corruption charges. The school board? Dismantled, with multiple resignations. The stolen money? Returned to the schools that had suffered. Ethan walked out of the courthouse a free man, his students and supporters cheering his name. But he wasn't just free. He had won. Not just for himself, but for every teacher, every student, every parent who had been ignored. Because this fight was never just about him. A new beginning. Months later, Ethan stood in front of a brand new school building, one funded by the returned money, now dedicated to serving the students who had been left behind for too long. And next to him? Jordan, holding his college acceptance letter, a future that had once seemed impossible. Ethan smiled, his heart full. They had tried to break him. They had tried to silence him. But in the end, he had made them listen. A call to action. Stand up for justice. Ethan Grant stood up against corruption. And he won. But this isn't just his fight. It's our fight. Like this video, if you believe every student deserves justice. Comment below. What do you think needs to change in our education system? Let's talk about it. Subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to stay silent. Because this fight is far from over. And your voice is part of it. The victory that changed everything. A teacher's legacy. The roar of the crowd outside the newly rebuilt Brookside High filled the air, a sound that sent chills down Ethan Grant's spine. It had been a long road, a battle that had nearly cost him everything, his career, his reputation, even his freedom. But now, standing before thousands of students, parents, teachers, and supporters, he knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. Because this was the future they had fought for, a hard-won fight for justice. 1 year ago, Brookside High had been on the brink of collapse. Its funding had been drained by corrupt officials. Its students had been forgotten. Its teachers had been pushed to the breaking point. Ethan had tried to expose the truth and had been punished for it. Fired. Framed. Arrested. But instead of giving up, he had done what no one expected. He had kept fighting. And in the end, the corrupt school board members were removed. The stolen funds were returned. New policies were enacted to prevent future abuse. And schools like Brookside received the funding they had deserved all along. This wasn't just a win for Brookside. It was a win for every forgotten student, every silenced teacher, every community that had been ignored for too long. The moment that defined a movement. Ethan stood at the newly built school entrance, microphone in hand, looking out at the faces of those who had stood with him. Students, parents, teachers, activists, the people who had refused to back down. 1 year ago, they told us this school had no future. His voice echoed through the massive crowd. They told us there wasn't enough money, that there wasn't enough hope. A wave of silence rippled through the audience. But they were wrong. The crowd erupted into cheers. Ethan's throat tightened with emotion. He had spent so many nights wondering if this moment would ever come, wondering if the system was too big, too powerful, too corrupt to change. But as he looked at the students now stepping into a school that had been saved, he realized something. The system had never been stronger than the people. It had only been stronger when the people were silent. The students who proved them wrong. At the front of the crowd stood Jordan Carter, the student who had once feared his dreams were impossible. Now, he stood tall, holding a college acceptance letter from Harvard University. Ethan motioned him forward. "Jordan, come here." The young man hesitated, then stepped onto the stage, gripping the microphone with shaking hands. "This school was supposed to close." His voice cracked with emotion. "They said we weren't worth saving." He turned to Ethan, his eyes shining with determination. "But because of you, Mr. Grant, we proved them wrong." The applause was deafening. Ethan clapped Jordan on the back, pride swelling in his chest, because this was what it had always been about. Not just saving a school, but saving futures, a legacy that will never be silenced. In the months that followed, Ethan took his fight national. He founded the Educators Alliance, a watchdog group that exposed corruption in school districts across the country, fought for better funding in underserved schools, provided legal aid to teachers facing retaliation for speaking out, and most importantly, he made sure no teacher or student would ever have to stand alone again. A lesson for the world. The fight is never over. As Ethan looked out at the sea of people who had once felt powerless, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about education. This was about life. Because the fight for fairness, for justice, for what is right, is never truly over. There will always be people in power who try to silence you. There will always be those who say the system can't change. And they win when good people stay quiet. But when people stand together, everything changes. A call to action. Be part of the change. Ethan Grant refused to stay silent. He stood up for his students, and he won. But this isn't just his fight. It's yours, too. Like this video if you believe every student deserves a fair chance. Comment below. What do you think needs to change in our education system? Let's talk about it. Subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to back down. Because the fight for justice isn't over. And your voice is part of it.